New polling estimates President Trump and Joe Biden are tied in Texas. The president won the Lone Star State by 9 points in 2016. But a survey by Quinnipiac University of likely voters shows the race is in a dead heat. The last Democratic presidential nominee to win Texas was Jimmy Carter in 1976. Data show Texas is leading the U.S. in early voting. More than 5.8 million people have already cast their ballots in the state. That's about 65% of the total votes cast there in the 2016 election. For the latest, let's bring in Renuka Rayasam. She's the Texas correspondent for Politico. Hi there, Renuka. Good to see you again. So Texas is already the nation's leader in ballots cast. Who do these early numbers favor, and what do those numbers tell us about expectations for Election Day?
Sure. So it's hard to say, and I know it's always an unsatisfactory answer. It's hard to say who these ballots favor at the moment, and that's because we don't know how these voters are voting. But there's a lot of evidence that it could be really favorable to Democrats. Higher turnout here has been favorable to them in the past as well, and so there's some sense that that some of these early voting numbers, you said nearly 6 million people have voted already in Texas, could really be a sign of a surge of Democratic voters here.
Well, a federal appeals court ruled last week Texas Republican Governor Greg Abbott can limit ballot drop-off locations to one per county. I mean, with a state the size of Texas, what does that mean?
Yes, so we've had a couple of rulings. So yes, so there's the ballot drop-off location, and when you're talking about counties like Harris County, Dallas County, Travis County, which includes Austin, these are big counties. That means that people are driving really long distances to drop off their ballot at these locations. But just today, shortly before we started talking, the Texas Supreme Court did say that that drive-through voting was okay, and that's something that the Republican governor had tried to stop. And so now the Harris County elected official, Lena Hidalgo, she's the Harris County judge. She's trying to sort out what that means, this new ruling and what that means. So yeah, so there's, this is definitely an interesting election in terms of how people are voting because of COVID, because of the virus. And so we're seeing all these new types of voting methods tested and being tested in courts in record time. And we're getting a mixed bag. So on one hand, you can't do, only one drop-off location per county, but on the other hand, you can do drive-through voting, apparently. So there's a lot to still sort out.
That is. And, I imagine it might be hard for people to keep up with everything, that there might be a bit of confusion among some voters there with things changing so rapidly here in the waning days before the election itself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's definitely been really confusing. And I wonder what that means for Election Day, because I do think a lot of people are going to maybe wait until Election Day to actually cast their ballot because of all the confusion, because they want to make sure the vote's counted, because they want to make sure that there's no doubt who they're voting for. And so the early voting totals may end up helping Democrats, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Democrats will win, because you may see a lot of Republicans that come out on Election Day. And so that's definitely a dynamic to watch.
Well, Texas has undergone a demographic shift within the last decade as more Latino and Asian Americans call the state home. How might that growing diversity impact the election and politics in Texas overall for years to come?
So, for years and years, Democrats in Texas have talked about, the Hispanic population here as sort of being being the thing that turns the state blue and being the thing that gets Democrats elected to office. We haven't seen that actually to be true. Republicans have proven to be popular with the Hispanic population in Texas. George W. Bush won 40% of the vote here. Now that's fallen as since I think George W. Bush was the high water mark for Republicans in Texas among Hispanics. But that support remains relatively strong. But as we're seeing younger voters, so younger Hispanics tend to favor Democrats, and Asian Americans tend to favor Democrats. And it's not 90-10 like you see among African American populations, but they're definitely tilting in favor of Democrats. And so that is one big demographic shift you're seeing, and you're seeing these populations starting to vote in greater numbers. I think there are both populations that didn't necessarily vote in large numbers, and we're starting to see more candidates reach out to these minority voters and try to get them to polls and try to engage them. And we're seeing that among both Republicans and Democrats. And then, in terms of demographic shifts, one of the biggest things you're seeing is not even necessarily race and ethnicity, but people moving from across Texas into the cities, into the suburbs, and from moving from other states into the cities and suburbs. So people moving from California to, say, a Dallas suburb. That's a huge shift that's just changing the nature of the voting patterns in some of these areas. Texas has added about 4 million people in the last decade.
Finally, Renuka, your newest Politico magazine article chronicles what's happening at the state level in Texas as Democrats say they have a chance of flipping the House. Why are Democrats confident, and what's at stake if Democrats were able to win the majority?
Sure. So this is still very much a Republican state. Despite the Democratic enthusiasm, despite the polls you're seeing for Biden, the governor Republican, the Texas State Senate will remain Republican. But Democrats feel like they have a shot for the first time in nearly 2 decades to win a majority in the Texas State House. They won 12 seats in 2018, and they need just 9 seats for the majority this year. It is a tough fight because, not only do they have to win those 9 seats, they have to protect the gains they made in 2018. But they have a lot of momentum on their side. They are incredibly well funded. Some of these local state house races where people sometimes don't even break 6 figures. At least they did it in 2018. Now they're raising, close to 7 figures. And so these are very high profile, high dollar races. There's a lot of momentum. And Democrats are betting that Trump's relative unpopularity here, I mean, he's still, like I said, still a Republican state, but Trump's popularity compared to previous Republican presidents has been weak. And so Democrats are hoping that all these trends, demographic changes, the money they have, the unpopularity of Trump will help them win the Texas State House. And there's a lot at stake. So the big thing at stake is redistricting. Next year is a redistricting cycle, and Democrats hope if they have a seat at the table. I mean, they can't exactly draw the maps that they want, but they can either force a compromise or get the maps kicked to the court. Or they'll have a lot of say in other policies. I mean, this is a very conservative legislature, or historically has been, that's passed abortion restrictions, that's loosened gun regulations, that's passed really strict immigration enforcement bills. And Democrats are hoping if they control the state house, they can stop some of the bills that they don't like.
All right, Renuka Rayasam. Renuka, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.